The rumor didn't start with a headline. It started with a whisper. A whisper passed from comment sections to message boards, from obscure blogs to late-night live streams, from "Did you hear?" to "Why isn't anyone talking about this?" And before anyone could pin down where it truly began, it had already grown teeth. What if one of the most tightly controlled public images of the modern royal era wasn't shaped by fairy tale romance, but by the internet's darkest rumor machine? What if the names you think you understand were never meant to be spoken together at all? And what if the most dangerous part of the story isn't whether the claims are true, but why so many people want them to be? Pause for a second. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this story is not about proof. It's not about declarations of guilt. It's about how narratives are built, weaponized, recycled, and believed. And once you see how that machinery works, you can't unsee it. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people miss. Some rumors don't survive because they're credible. They survive because they're useful. Useful to algorithms. Useful to outrage culture. Useful to audiences desperate for hidden villains and forbidden connections. And nowhere is that more visible than in the online ecosystem that somehow fused three names that, on paper, should never coexist in the same sentence. A convicted socialite, a disgraced royal, and a woman whose life has been dissected, reframed, and rewritten more times than almost anyone in modern public life. How did that happen? Why did it happen? And why now? Those are the questions no one slows down long enough to ask. So let's slow it down. Because before we talk about claims, we have to talk about context. Before we talk about stories, we have to talk about why people crave them. And before we talk about what the internet says, we have to understand what the internet does. This matters now because we are living in an era where repetition feels like evidence. See something once, you dismiss it. See it twice, you hesitate. See it 10 times, and your brain quietly asks, what if? That's how modern rumor culture works. Not through confirmation, but through saturation. And the story we're unpacking tonight is a masterclass in that process. It didn't emerge from court transcripts or sworn testimony. It didn't come from verified documents or established timelines. It came from fragments. A photograph taken out of context. A name appearing near another name. A leap made in a comment thread that no one bothered to challenge. Then another leap. Then another. Soon, speculation becomes narrative. Narrative becomes assumption. And assumption becomes everyone knows. But do they? Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how the most viral stories rarely begin with facts, but with emotion? Anger, betrayal, suspicion, a sense that someone, somewhere, got away with something. That emotional spark is what powers the machine. And once the machine is running, it doesn't care who gets caught in the gears. Here's where things get uncomfortable. When a public figure becomes a symbol. Not a person, people stop asking whether claims are fair. They start asking whether claims feel right. And feels right is a dangerous standard. Because it allows contradictions to coexist without challenge. It allows timelines to blur. It allows unrelated scandals to merge. It allows guilt by proximity to masquerade as logic. This is how internet mythology is born. And one of the most persistent myths of the last decade revolves around luxury, secrecy, and the seductive image of the yacht. Why yachts? Because yachts represent everything the public imagines but cannot see. They float beyond jurisdiction. They suggest privacy without oversight. They symbolize wealth detached from consequence. So when rumors search for a stage, yachts are the perfect backdrop. No walls, no witnesses, just open water and closed doors. It's cinematic, it's sinister, and it's incredibly effective storytelling, whether it's true or not. Now add another ingredient. A disgraced royal whose name is already associated, in documented ways, with scandal and poor judgment. When a figure already exists in the public mind as tainted, rumors don't need to work as hard. They borrow credibility from outrage already earned. This is where things get slippery, because documented controversies become magnets. And once someone is a magnet, every unrelated theory sticks more easily. Then comes the final ingredient. A woman whose public image inspires extremes. Admiration from some, resentment from others, obsession from many. A woman whose every move has been analyzed not just as action, but as motive. And suddenly, three separate narratives, each complex on their own, collapse into a single, simplified story online. Not because the evidence demands it, but because the audience does. This is where the rumor ecosystem reveals its true nature. It doesn't ask, is this accurate? It asks, does this satisfy a suspicion I already have? And if the answer is yes, the rumor lives. Even when timelines don't align. Even when sources trace back to screenshots of anonymous posts. Even when the story mutates with each retelling. In fact, mutation helps it survive. Contradictions don't weaken rumors, they strengthen them. Why? Because every contradiction invites a new explanation. And every explanation invites another video, another thread, another deep dive. Suddenly, the lack of proof becomes proof of a cover-up. That's the most dangerous pivot of all. Once absence of evidence is reframed as evidence of absence being hidden, the story becomes immune to reality. At that point, denial confirms guilt, silence confirms conspiracy, and correction becomes complicity. Ask yourself honestly, how many times have you seen someone say, if it wasn't true, they would have sued? As if legal strategy is the same thing as moral admission. This is why these narratives matter. Because they don't just target individuals, they train audiences to distrust the very idea of verification. And once that happens, anyone can be rewritten. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Some people don't follow these stories because they want justice. They follow them because they want coherence. They want the world to make sense. And nothing creates a sense of order like believing there is a hidden script behind chaos. A puppet master. A secret circle. A yacht where everything connects. It's simpler than accepting randomness. It's easier than admitting coincidence. And it's far more entertaining than ambiguity. But entertainment has consequences. Because once a rumor reaches a certain size, it stops being entertainment and starts being identity. People don't just believe it, they defend it. Challenge the story, and you're accused of being naive. Ask for sources, and you're told to do your research. Point out inconsistencies, and you're labeled suspicious. That's how belief systems form. And that's why this story refuses to die. Not because new information keeps emerging, but because the same claims keep being repackaged. New thumbnails, new wording, new urgency. Just revealed. Finally exposed. They don't want you to know. Notice something? The revelation is always happening, but never finishes. There's always one more layer, one more witness, one more file about to drop. That perpetual almost there is not a bug. It's the design. Because closure would end engagement. Uncertainty keeps it alive. So when people ask, why are these rumors resurfacing now? The answer is rarely about events. It's about cycles, news lulls, algorithm shifts, audience fatigue with old villains, and hunger for recycled ones. The internet doesn't move forward. It loops. And every loop strips context while amplifying emotion. Which brings us back to the whisper. The whisper that said, there's more to this. The whisper that said, they're all connected. The whisper that turned speculation into certainty for millions of viewers who never saw the original source. That's what we're unpacking. Not a verdict, not an accusation, but a phenomenon. Because understanding how these narratives are built is the only way to stop being controlled by them. And in the next section, we're going to do something most videos never do. We're going to rewind. All the way back to where these threads first intersected online. Before the headlines, before the outrage, before the story hardened into belief. We're going to look at the earliest versions. The first jumps in logic. The moments where speculation quietly became common knowledge. And when you see how small the spark was, you may start questioning how big the fire ever really should have become. But be warned. Once you see the origin point, you'll also see something else. A decision. A moment where this story could have faded. Or exploded. And someone chose explosion. The spark didn't come from a courtroom. It didn't come from a newspaper. It didn't even come from a named source. It came from a post that almost no one remembers anymore. Buried. Unverified. Written in the confident tone of someone who knew they would never be challenged. And that's where this next part gets unsettling. Because when people talk about where the rumors started, they usually imagine a moment of revelation. A document leak. A secret interview. A dramatic confession. That's not what happened here. What happened was quieter. More ordinary. More dangerous. It began with aggregation. A blog post referencing a forum thread. A forum thread referencing a comment. A comment referencing things people have been saying for years. No dates, no names, no accountability, just implication. And implication, when repeated often enough, starts to feel like information. Let's rewind carefully. Early versions of this narrative didn't name everyone outright. They hinted, they suggested, they used phrases like circles, overlapping worlds, social scenes. This matters because it shows intent. Direct accusations invite scrutiny. Hints invite imagination. And imagination does the rest of the work for free. At first, the story wasn't even about a specific individual. It was about a setting. Luxury. Elite parties. Unspoken rules. The yacht was the stage before the characters were cast. Why? Because settings feel neutral. They feel descriptive. They feel safe. No one sues over a setting. So the earliest posts didn't say, "This person did this." They said, "These kinds of things happened in places like this." And audiences filled in the blanks. Here's the trick. Once you accept a setting as corrupt, anyone associated with the setting becomes suspect by default. That's not logic. That's narrative gravity. The gravity pulls names inward. This is where timelines start collapsing. Different years, different locations, different social circles. But online, proximity replaces chronology. If two names appear near each other often enough, the brain connects them whether they ever intersected or not. This is how rumor culture compresses reality. Now pause and ask yourself something. How often do you see a claim and instinctively assume someone else has already verified it? That assumption is the backbone of this entire ecosystem. Everyone thinks someone else checked. No one actually does. So when early posts began tying elite social scenes to broader scandals, the audience nodded along. Not because the claims were proven, but because they fit a pattern already established in the public imagination. Pattern recognition feels smart. It feels analytical. It feels like insight. But pattern recognition without verification is just storytelling. And storytelling spreads faster than facts. As these posts migrated from forums to blogs, something else happened. The tone shifted. What began as questions slowly became assertions. Not outright. Not yet. But the language hardened. Some say became many believe. Speculation became long rumored. Alleged became implied but unstated. Each step subtle enough to avoid confrontation. Each step strong enough to deepen belief. Here's a key moment most people miss. At a certain point, the rumor stops needing a source. It becomes self-sourcing. Articles link to each other. Videos cite other videos. Threads reference screenshots of threads. It's a closed loop. And inside a closed loop, repetition replaces evidence. This is where search engines come in. Because once a phrase is searched often enough, it becomes visible. Visibility creates legitimacy. Legitimacy creates curiosity. Curiosity fuels more searches. It's circular, and it's brutal. The algorithm doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Do people click?" And people click on mystery. Now let's talk about escalation. Early versions of this narrative were vague enough to be dismissed. But vagueness frustrates audiences. They want specifics. They want characters. They want stakes. So later retellings added detail. Not source detail. Narrative detail. A year here. A location there. A supposed insider who always remains anonymous. And here's the critical shift. Once details appear, people stop questioning the foundation. They argue over the details instead. That's a psychological pivot point. Debating specifics creates the illusion that the core premise is settled. It isn't, but it feels like it is. So instead of asking, "Is this narrative real?" audiences ask, "Which version is more accurate?" That question keeps the story alive indefinitely. And the more versions exist, the harder it becomes to trace the original claim. Because now there is no original claim. There's only a cloud. This is where contradiction becomes camouflage. One post says one thing. Another says the opposite. Supporters say, that proves how complex it is. Complexity is used as a shield. But real complexity comes with documentation. This kind comes with improvisation. Now consider something else. Every time a public figure becomes involved in an unrelated controversy, old rumors resurface. Not because new information emerged, but because attention did. Attention is oxygen, and the rumor ecosystem is very good at waiting. Years can pass in silence. Then a headline hits, and suddenly, archived speculation is repackaged as relevance. People are talking again. Why now? What changed? Often, nothing changed. The algorithm just needed content. And content creators needed hooks. Here's the part few admit. Not everyone spreading these narratives believes them. Some spread them because they perform. They drive engagement. They provoke reaction. They polarize. Outrage is sticky. Nuance is not. So the story evolves to maximize emotion. More betrayal. More secrecy. More implication. But never resolution. Because resolution ends clicks. Let's be honest for a moment. Have you noticed how often these stories promise a final revelation and then defer it? Part 2 will shock you. Wait until you hear what happens next. This changes everything. But it never changes everything. It just changes the packaging. This is not accidental. It's structural. The rumor ecosystem isn't designed to uncover truth. It's designed to sustain interest. Truth has an endpoint. Interest does not. Now let's zoom in on the audience's role. Because the audience isn't passive. Viewers reward narratives that confirm their emotional expectations. If someone already distrusts elites, they gravitate towards stories that validate that distrust. If someone already resents a public figure, they accept narratives that cast that figure in shadow. This isn't about gullibility. It's about coherence. People want stories that make their worldview feel consistent. And when a narrative offers that consistency, it doesn't need proof. It needs resonance. This is why debunking often fails. Debunking addresses facts. Belief is emotional. You can't fact-check a feeling. You can only out-narrate it. And that's why this story persists. Not because it's strong, but because it's adaptable. Strip away one claim, another appears. Challenge one source, another is cited. It's a hydra, and every head feeds the same core assumption, that something hidden must exist. Because if nothing were hidden, why would the story survive? That logic is backwards, but it's compelling. Now we're approaching the moment where this narrative crossed a line. The moment when suggestion hardened into something more dangerous. When speculation stopped being framed as possibility and started being framed as suppressed truth. That's the pivot. Because once a story positions itself as what they don't want you to know, it gains immunity. Any challenge becomes proof of suppression. Any silence becomes confirmation. That's when rumor becomes belief. And belief becomes identity. In the next section, we're going to look at that pivot in detail. The exact point where tone shifted. Where disclaimers vanished. Where speculation was no longer sold as curiosity, but as courage. The moment when asking questions was replaced by making claims. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Because from that point on, the story wasn't chasing truth anymore. It was chasing vindication. And that chase changed everything. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no headline saying, from this point on, speculation becomes certainty. But the language changed. And language is everything. If you want to understand how this narrative crossed from rumor into something far more entrenched, you have to listen closely to the words people started using. Not what they said outright, but how they said it. Early on, creators and posters leaned on cushions. Allegedly. Some believe. Questions remain. Those words act like legal and psychological airbags. They slow impact. They signal uncertainty. They give the audience permission to stay curious without committing. Then, slowly, those cushions disappeared. Not all at once. One phrase at a time. Allegedly became implied. Some believe became many know. Questions were replaced with statements that ended in ellipses instead of question marks. And here's the crucial thing. Audiences rarely notice this transition consciously. But their brains do. Certainty feels different. It lands harder. It sticks longer. Once a creator speaks with confidence, the viewer assumes confidence is earned. That's the unspoken contract. So when videos began saying things like the truth they don't want discussed instead of online speculation, the tone itself did the persuading. Not facts. Not evidence. Tone. This is where disclaimers quietly died. They weren't removed. They were buried. A quick sentence at the beginning. A vague line in the description. A rushed comment pinned below. Meanwhile, the body of the content spoke as if the premise was settled. That contradiction matters. Because most viewers don't remember disclaimers. They remember narratives. So even when creators could say, I never claimed this was fact, the emotional takeaway told a different story. That's how plausible deniability works in modern content. Say the words once. Tell the story like it's true for an hour. Now let's talk about escalation pressure. Once one creator leans further into certainty, others feel forced to follow. Why? Because ambiguity doesn't compete well in the algorithm. A video titled "Questions about Online Claims" will always lose to the truth finally exposed. So creators face a choice. Stay cautious and get buried, or escalate and get clicks. They imply that only insiders understand. That skepticism means you're behind. That doubt is evidence of manipulation. So belief becomes a badge of awareness. And awareness becomes identity. This is where communities form. Comment sections stop debating facts and start reinforcing belonging. You see it too. People are waking up. They can't silence this forever. Notice the language. It's not about information. It's about awakening. And awakening stories are powerful because they flatter the audience. They say, "You're not fooled. You're not like the others. You see through the lie." Once someone internalizes that, evidence becomes irrelevant. Because challenging the story now challenges the self. That's why corrections bounce off. They're perceived not as clarifications, but as attacks. And attacks demand defense. Now let's look at the moment monetization enters the picture. Because belief systems don't just spread, they sustain. As views rise, revenue follows. As revenue follows, incentives solidify. Creators who might have once hesitated now have proof that certainty pays. And once income depends on a narrative, objectivity erodes. Not necessarily consciously, but subtly. Which detail do you emphasize? Which counterpoint do you minimize? Which timeline do you stretch? Small choices accumulate. And over time, the narrative stops being examined. It's maintained. Here's something most people don't realize. Many creators never go back to reevaluate their earliest claims. Why would they? Revisiting the origin would expose how thin it was. And thin origins threaten thick audiences. So instead, the story moves forward, never backward. Each new video references the last. Each last video references the one before. The chain grows long enough that no one wants to trace it back. This is how myths protect themselves. Length becomes authority. Now consider the role of silence. Public figures are often advised not to respond to rumors. Engaging amplifies them. Litigation takes time. Ignoring can starve attention. But in the rumor ecosystem, silence is repurposed. If it wasn't true, they deny it. If they deny it, they're lying. If they sue, it's intimidation. Every response becomes confirmation. Every non-response becomes confirmation. This is a closed system. And closed systems don't correct themselves. They intensify. Now think about timing. Why do certain versions of this story surge at specific moments? Not randomly. During unrelated controversies. During anniversaries. During news cycles hungry for content. Old claims are reintroduced with new urgency. Why isn't anyone talking about this? Why now? As if now itself is evidence. But now is often just opportunity. The audience rarely notices this recycling. They experience it as discovery. Because memory online is short and emotion resets fast. So each wave feels fresh. Now let's talk about the most dangerous evolution. At a certain point, narratives like this stop being about individuals. They become symbolic. One person represents corruption. Another represents betrayal. Another represents manipulation. Once someone becomes a symbol, they're no longer human in the story. They're functions. And functions don't get the benefit of complexity. They get simplified, flattened, and exaggerated. That's when empathy disappears. And when empathy disappears, restraint follows. This is where rhetoric hardens. Language becomes harsher. Claims become bolder. Moral certainty replaces curiosity. And anyone who questions the narrative is no longer just wrong. They're suspect. Why are you defending them? What side are you on? That binary is fatal to nuance. Now here's the part that should unsettle you the most. Once a narrative reaches this stage, even its creators can't easily exit. Because stepping back looks like betrayal. Admitting uncertainty looks like weakness. Correcting course looks like complicity. So the story continues, not because it's true, but because stopping it is too costly. That's how runaway narratives happen. Not through conspiracy, through momentum. And momentum doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about direction. In the next section, we're going to examine the emotional triggers that make audiences especially vulnerable to this kind of story. Why certain themes, secrecy, elites, yachts, hidden worlds, bypass critical thinking, and go straight to instinct. Why these stories feel convincing even when they're unsupported. And why, once someone emotionally commits, logic struggles to compete. Because until you understand that emotional architecture, it's impossible to understand why this narrative, and others like it, refuse to collapse. And once you see that architecture clearly, you'll start noticing it everywhere. There's a reason certain stories bypass your skepticism and go straight for your gut. They don't ask permission. They don't knock. They slip in through instincts you didn't realize were there. To understand why this narrative gains such traction, you have to stop looking at it like a claim and start looking at it like a trigger. Because what keeps it alive isn't information. It's emotion. And not just any emotion. Very specific ones. Suspicion, resentment, moral outrage. And perhaps the most powerful of all, the feeling that something unfair happened and no one paid for it. That feeling is gasoline. And this story was designed, intentionally or not, to strike the match. Let's start with the idea of secrecy. Human brains are wired to distrust closed systems. When something happens behind gates, walls, or wealth, people instinctively assume the worst. Not because they're cynical, but because secrecy removes accountability. Now add luxury to that secrecy. Yachts. Private islands. Invitation-only spaces. These aren't just locations. They're symbols. They represent a world without oversight. So when a rumor uses those settings, it doesn't need to explain why something could happen there. The audience already believes it could. That belief comes pre-installed. This is why hidden stories spread faster than visible ones. A crime in a public square demands proof. A wrongdoing on a yacht demands imagination. And imagination fills gaps effortlessly. Next trigger, elites. There is a deep, simmering cultural suspicion toward people who seem insulated from consequences. Whether justified or not, it's real. When someone is wealthy, powerful, or connected, audiences are primed to believe two things simultaneously: that they have access others don't, and that they get away with things others wouldn't. So when a rumor links a scandal to elite circles, it doesn't feel like a leap. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation of a frustration many people already carry. And frustration wants an outlet. This is why stories framed as what they don't want you to know spread faster than stories framed as here's what happened. Because the former validates the feeling of exclusion. It says, you were right to be suspicious. Now let's talk about betrayal. Betrayal is one of the strongest narrative accelerants known. People will forgive incompetence. They'll forgive ignorance. They struggle to forgive perceived deception. So when a public figure's image conflicts with a rumor about their past, the tension between those two versions creates outrage. Not because the rumor is proven, but because it threatens the image people formed. And here's the twist. Both admirers and critics react strongly. Critics feel vindicated. Admirers feel destabilized. Both emotions drive engagement. That's why these narratives attract polarized audiences, not neutral ones. Now layer in something else. Moral sorting. Many people subconsciously divide the world into deserving and undeserving. Deserving of sympathy, deserving of punishment. Once someone is placed in the undeserving category, claims against them face far less resistance. People stop asking, is this true? They start asking, would I be surprised? That's a dangerous pivot. Because wouldn't be surprised is not a standard of truth. It's a standard of bias. But bias feels like intuition. And intuition feels smart. This is where emotional architecture does its most effective work. It transforms assumptions into instincts. Now consider irony. Irony makes stories sticky. The idea that someone publicly associated with certain values might secretly violate them is irresistible. It feels poetic. It feels like exposure, even when it isn't. This is why narratives that include double lives perform so well. They promise reversal. They say, what you thought you knew was wrong. That promise is intoxicating because it gives the audience a sense of discovery, and discovery feels empowering. Now here's the part most people overlook. These stories don't just trigger emotions, they reward them. Anger is rewarded with likes. Suspicion is rewarded with comments. Outrage is rewarded with shares. Social platforms are not neutral. They amplify what keeps people engaged. And nothing engages like feeling morally alert. So when viewers feel they're connecting dots, their brains release the same satisfaction chemicals as solving a puzzle, even if the puzzle pieces don't belong together. especially if they don't, because forcing coherence where none exists feels like intelligence. Now let's talk about repetition again, but from an emotional angle. Repeated exposure doesn't just normalize a claim. It desensitizes doubt. The first time you hear a rumor, skepticism is loud. The 10th time, skepticism whispers. The 100th time, it's silent. Not because you're convinced, but because your brain is tired. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort lowers defenses. This is why even people who say, "I don't really believe it," can still be emotionally influenced by the narrative. Belief isn't binary. It's cumulative. An emotional belief can exist without intellectual agreement. Now consider the role of outrage fatigue. The modern audience is constantly exposed to scandal. Eventually, novelty becomes currency. Old villains lose potency. New ones must be introduced, or old ones recontextualized. This creates pressure to escalate narratives, to add layers, to deepen stakes, to imply greater darkness. This is how stories grow teeth. Not because evidence appears, but because attention demands intensity. And once intensity is introduced, it rarely retreats. Now let's address the audience's quiet complicity. This is uncomfortable, but necessary. Many viewers consume these stories not because they seek truth, but because they seek permission. Permission to dislike someone. Permission to judge. Permission to feel superior. The narrative provides that permission. It says, your discomfort was justified. And that validation is powerful, because it transforms emotion into righteousness. Once righteousness enters the room, humility leaves. That's when listening stops. Now here's the most important emotional trigger of all. Fear of being fooled. No one wants to believe they were manipulated. So when someone has invested time or emotion into a narrative, admitting uncertainty feels like admitting gullibility. It's easier to double down. This is called commitment escalation, and it's why even discredited stories persist. Letting go hurts pride, so belief becomes armor. Now pause for a moment. Think about how often you've seen someone say, "I don't care if it's true. It says something." That sentence reveals everything. It admits the story's symbolic value outweighs its factual accuracy. And once a narrative becomes symbolic, truth becomes optional. Symbols don't need proof. They need resonance. This is why dismantling these stories is so difficult. You're not arguing facts. You're challenging meaning. And meaning fights back. Now we arrive at a critical realization. This narrative didn't succeed because it was well supported. It succeeded because it was emotionally efficient. It delivered suspicion quickly, outrage cleanly, closure without resolution. And in a fragmented media landscape, efficiency wins. But here's the twist. The same emotional architecture that builds these narratives can also collapse them. Because emotional systems have pressure points. And one of those pressure points is exposure. Not exposure of individuals, but exposure of mechanisms. When people see how they're being guided, nudged, and rewarded for certain reactions, something shifts. Curiosity replaces certainty, and certainty is the fuel. Which brings us to the next section. Because now that you understand the emotional blueprint, we're going to apply it. We're going to take one specific moment, a viral surge point, and dissect exactly how all these triggers converged at once. Timing, language, platform incentives. We'll examine why that moment mattered more than any claim attached to it. And why, after that surge, the narrative was no longer just circulating. It was self-sustaining. Because once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't need believers. It needs participants. And that's when things truly spiral. The surge didn't happen because of new information. That's the part people get wrong. They assume virality follows revelation, that something surfaced, someone spoke, a document appeared. But in this case, nothing materially changed. What changed was alignment. All the forces we've been talking about. Emotion, timing, incentives, and audience readiness snapped into place at once. And when that happens, even the weakest spark can look like an explosion. Let's isolate the moment. Not by date. Dates are less important here, but by conditions. First, there was a lull. No dominant scandal commanding attention. No singular villain monopolizing outrage. Just a restless audience scrolling, waiting to feel something. That matters more than people realize. Outrage culture doesn't run continuously at peak intensity. It cycles. When one story fades, the system looks for another emotional anchor. That's when archived narratives resurface. Old claims don't disappear. They hibernate. Then something small happened. Not a revelation, a reminder. A clip resurfaced. A phrase trended. A thumbnail reused familiar language. Nothing new, but familiar. And familiarity is powerful, because the audience didn't experience it as repetition. They experienced it as rediscovery. Why is this coming up again? What did I miss? Why didn't I hear about this before? Those questions are not neutral. They prime the viewer to assume significance. Now at timing. This resurgence coincided with broader cultural frustration, distrust of institutions, anger at elites, fatigue with official narratives. When people are already primed to believe systems fail, stories that suggest hidden wrongdoing slide in easily. Not because they're proven, because they're plausible. Plausibility is not truth. But in emotional reasoning, plausibility is enough. Here's where language did its quiet work. The content didn't scream accusation. It whispered implication. People are connecting dots. This raises questions. It's interesting how these names keep appearing. Those phrases don't assert, they invite. An invitation is far more effective than instruction. Because when someone feels they arrived at a conclusion themselves, they defend it more fiercely. This is crucial. The most successful narratives don't tell the audience what to think. They create an environment where the audience thinks it chose the thought. That's exactly what happened here. Creators presented fragments. A timeline snippet. A photo. A quote taken from an unrelated context. Then they paused. They asked the audience what they thought. That pause is where belief enters. Because the viewer fills the silence with their own assumptions. And once someone contributes to a narrative, even mentally, they become invested. Now let's talk about amplification. Once engagement spikes, platforms step in. Not maliciously, automatically. Algorithms detect patterns, not truth. They see watch time. They see comments. They see rewatches. And they respond by showing the content to more people who behave similarly. That's how echo chambers form. Not because someone builds them, but because they perform. As the content spreads, it mutates. One creator emphasizes betrayal. Another emphasizes secrecy. Another emphasizes moral outrage. Each variation attracts a slightly different emotional profile. Together, they form a cluster. And once a cluster exists, it reinforces itself. People move between videos, between threads, between interpretations. They're not seeking verification. They're seeking coherence. And the cluster provides it. Now here's the inflection point. At a certain threshold of visibility, the narrative becomes known. Not proven. Known. You can hear it in the phrasing. Everyone's talking about this. You can't ignore it anymore. It's everywhere. Ubiquity is mistaken for validity. And once a story feels ubiquitous, questioning it feels futile. Why fight something that feels inevitable? This is where skepticism quietly exits. Now consider creator psychology. Once a narrative takes off, there's pressure not to be left behind. No one wants to miss a wave. So creators who might have ignored the story earlier now feel compelled to address it. Some do so cautiously. Some lean in. Some escalate. But even cautious coverage contributes. Because attention is additive. Every video, even critical ones, feed the same keyword ecosystem. Search engines don't distinguish between skepticism and support. They see interest. And interest multiplies. Now let's examine the role of urgency. Titles start using countdown language. Breaking. Just surfaced. Finally revealed. Urgency short-circuits critical thinking. It tells the brain, act now, evaluate later. This is ancient wiring. Urgency evolved to keep us alive, not informed. So when content frames itself as time-sensitive, audiences click first and question second. Or not at all. Now here's something subtle but powerful. During the surge, the narrative became emotionally synchronized across platforms. What someone saw on one platform reinforced what they saw on another. A clip here, a comment there, a headline elsewhere. Even if the sources were independent, the effect was cumulative. It felt coordinated, not because it was, but because repetition creates the illusion of consensus. This is how belief systems gain momentum. They don't require agreement. They require alignment. Now let's talk about silence again, but differently. During this surge, official channels didn't respond. Not because they needed to, not because they should have, but because responding would have amplified the story further. However, in the emotional ecosystem, silence was reframed. It's spreading too fast. They're panicking. They can't stop it now. Silence became narrative fuel. This is the trap. Once a story reaches this stage, no response is correct. Engagement amplifies. Silence confirms. That's why these surges are so difficult to counter. They're not built on claims that can be disproven. They're built on interpretations that can't be satisfied. Now here's the turning point that most people miss. During the surge, the narrative stopped being about discovery. It became about participation. People weren't just watching. They were contributing, speculating in comments, sharing clips with added commentary, making their own connections. This is critical. Once people invest creative energy into a story, they become co-authors. And co-authors don't. That's why focusing on individual claims misses the point. The real story is the system. And the system rewards narratives that simplify complexity, moralize ambiguity, and promise revelation without delivering it. Now in the next section, we're going to confront the question most people avoid. Responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Not personal blame. Narrative responsibility. Who sustains these stories once they take off? Who benefits? And who gets harmed? Not just directly, but indirectly. We're going to look at how audience behavior, creator incentives, and platform design intersect. Because once you see that triangle clearly, it becomes impossible to believe these narratives are just accidents of curiosity. They're outcomes. And understanding outcomes is the first step toward choosing differently. But be warned, that choice isn't comfortable, because it requires questioning not just what you watch, but why you watch it. And that's a much harder mirror to look into. Responsibility is the word everyone circles and almost no one wants to land on. Because responsibility implies choice. And choice implies that what's happening isn't inevitable, it's enabled. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, not for public figures, but for everyone participating in the ecosystem that keeps these narratives alive. Creators, platforms, audiences. Each plays a role. Each benefits differently. Each pays a cost. Even if they don't feel it immediately. Let's start with creators. Most people imagine content creators as either villains or truth-tellers, manipulators or whistleblowers. But reality is far messier. Many creators don't set out to mislead. They start with curiosity, with skepticism, with "this is interesting." But curiosity is not neutral once it's monetized. The moment a creator sees a spike, views climbing, comments flooding in, subscribers surging, the narrative shifts from exploration to optimization. What performed? What kept people watching? What triggered the strongest reactions? Those questions slowly replace. Is this solid? Not because creators are immoral, but because the system trains them to prioritize engagement over accuracy. And here's the trap. Once a creator builds an audience around a certain kind of story, pivoting away becomes risky. Audiences don't subscribe to uncertainty. They subscribe to confidence. So if a creator suddenly pulls back, adds nuance, or questions earlier assumptions, they risk alienating the very people who elevated them. This creates narrative inertia. The story must continue, or the channel stalls. And stalling feels like failure. So escalation becomes safer than restraint. Now let's talk about platforms. Social platforms like to present themselves as neutral hosts, mirrors reflecting user interest. But mirrors distort depending on how they're shaped. Algorithms are not passive. They amplify what performs. And performance is measured emotionally, not intellectually. Watch time, replays, comments, shares. None of these measure truth. They measure impact. So when a narrative provokes outrage, suspicion, or moral certainty, platforms push it further, not because it's accurate, but because it's effective. This is structural, not conspiratorial. No one has to decide to promote misinformation. The system does it automatically. And once a narrative enters that feedback loop, it gains momentum faster than corrections ever could. Corrections are calm. Narratives are emotional. Calm does not win in an attention economy. Now we arrive at the hardest part. The audience. This is where fingers start pointing, and where resistance usually appears. Because no one likes being told they're part of the problem. But participation doesn't require belief. It requires attention. Every click is a signal. Every comment is a boost. Every share is an endorsement, even if it's critical. And here's the paradox. Many viewers engage with these stories to critique them, debunk them, or express disbelief. But engagement itself fuels visibility. So even opposition feeds the same machine. This is how narratives grow beyond their creators. They become collective projects. Now let's talk about harm, because this is where responsibility becomes real. The harm of these narratives isn't always obvious. It's not always immediate. It's not always measurable, but it accumulates. First, there's reputational harm. Even when framed as questions or rumors, repetition alone alters perception. People may say, "I don't know if it's true, but that but matters," because it plants doubt without evidence. And doubt, once planted, is hard to uproot. Then there's psychological harm. Public figures become symbols rather than people. Their complexity is stripped away, their humanity flattened. This makes empathy optional. And once empathy disappears, cruelty becomes easier to justify. Now consider collateral harm. Families, children, associates. They didn't choose the narrative, but they absorb the consequences. Search results don't distinguish context. Rumors don't stay contained. They leak into everyday life. Now zoom out further. There's a broader cultural harm too. When rumor ecosystems thrive, trust erodes. Trust in journalism. Trust in verification. Trust in disagreement. Everything becomes suspect. And once that happens, truth loses its anchor. People stop asking, "What happened?" They start asking, "Who do I trust?" And trust becomes tribal. That's dangerous, because tribes don't resolve disagreements. They escalate them. Now let's examine the justification often used to dismiss responsibility. People should think critically. That sounds reasonable, but it ignores reality. Critical thinking is not a default state. It's a skill that requires time, energy, and incentive. The modern media environment strips all three. Endless feeds, constant urgency, emotional overload. When people are tired, stressed, or angry, critical thinking shuts down. Emotion takes the wheel, and narratives that align with existing feelings glide through effortlessly. This is not a moral failing. It's a cognitive one, and systems that exploit it bear responsibility too. Now consider something subtle but profound. The rumor ecosystem thrives on asymmetry. It takes seconds to make a claim, minutes to repeat it, hours to debunk it. And even then, the debunk rarely travels as far as the claim. Why? Because debunking lacks novelty. It doesn't shock. It doesn't outrage. It doesn't flatter. So even when corrections exist, they're drowned out. This creates a moral imbalance. Those spreading narratives face little cost. Those targeted bear disproportionate burden. Now let's talk about accountability. Who is accountable when a narrative spreads across thousands of creators and millions of viewers? No single person, no single platform. That diffusion of responsibility makes inaction easier. Everyone assumes someone else will correct it. But correction requires visibility, and visibility requires engagement, which feeds the cycle again. This is the dilemma. Now here's a question worth asking. Why do so many people feel drawn to these stories, even when they acknowledge the problems? Because these narratives provide something real, even if the claims aren't. They provide meaning. They transform chaos into storyline. They assign roles. They create villains and victims. That structure feels comforting, especially in a world that feels unstable. But comfort built on distortion has a cost. It warps perception. It trains people to see implication everywhere. And once you see implication everywhere, neutrality feels like ignorance. Now let's confront the hardest truth of all. Most people don't consume these narratives because they want to harm someone. They consume them because they want to feel informed, alert, and morally awake. That desire is human. But when it's hijacked by systems that reward exaggeration and certainty, it becomes dangerous. Awareness becomes accusation. Curiosity becomes conviction. Now here's where choice re-enters the picture. Responsibility doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean disengagement. It doesn't mean blind trust in authority. It means friction, slowing down, asking uncomfortable questions, not about the subject, but about the source. Who benefits from this framing? What emotion is this trying to provoke? What's missing? Those questions don't kill curiosity. They sharpen it. And sharpened curiosity is harder to manipulate. Now let's look forward. Because understanding responsibility isn't the end. It's the beginning of a different kind of engagement. One that resists urgency. One that values context. One that recognizes how easily emotion masquerades as insight. In the final stretch of this series, we're going to do something different. We're going to step back from this specific narrative and examine how these same mechanics appear again and again across entirely different stories. Different names, different scandals, same structure. Once you recognize the pattern, it stops being invisible. And once it stops being invisible, it loses much of its power. But there's one final layer we haven't addressed yet: the role of identity. How believing or rejecting these narratives becomes part of who people think they are, and why challenging the story can feel like a personal attack, even when it isn't. That layer explains why these debates feel so explosive and so unresolvable. Because once belief becomes identity, facts don't just fail to persuade. They threaten. And that's where the real conflict lives. Identity is the final lock. It's the reason these narratives don't just circulate, they harden. It's why conversations about them don't feel like debates, but battles. And it's why walking away from them feels, for some people, like losing a part of themselves. Because once a belief stops being something you hold and starts being something you are, everything changes. Let's unpack that carefully. At first, engagement with a story is casual. Someone watches a video, reads a thread, feels a spark of curiosity or outrage. No commitment yet. But then comes repetition. The story reappears in a new format, from a different creator. It starts to feel familiar. Familiarity lowers resistance. Then comes interaction. A comment, a like, a share with a caption like, interesting, or just asking questions. That's a small act, but it matters, because interaction is investment. Now the viewer isn't just consuming the story. They're participating in it. Participation creates attachment. And attachment is the bridge to identity. Here's where the shift happens. The narrative begins to align with how the person sees themselves. Not consciously, subtly. They're not someone who watches videos. They're someone who's informed. Someone who sees through lies. Someone who isn't fooled. That self-image is powerful. And once a narrative reinforces it, questioning the narrative feels like questioning the self. This is why pushback doesn't land as information. It lands as insult. You're wrong becomes you're naive. This isn't proven becomes you're blind. Slow down becomes you're defending them. At that point, logic is no longer the battlefield. Identity is. And identity fights dirty. Now let's look at how group identity forms around these stories. People find others who agree. Comment sections become communities. Communities become echo chambers. Inside those spaces, shared belief becomes social glue. Agreement earns approval. Doubt earns suspicion. Language evolves. We start appearing. So many of us see this. People are waking up. Once we enters the vocabulary, the line is drawn. There's us, the aware, and them, the deceived. This binary is intoxicating because it offers belonging. Belonging is one of the strongest human needs, and narratives that provide belonging are incredibly hard to dislodge. Now think about what happens when someone tries to leave. They question a detail. They express uncertainty. They suggest nuance. The response is rarely curiosity. It's often accusation. You've changed. You're compromised. What happened to you? Leaving the narrative isn't treated as growth. It's treated as betrayal. That social cost keeps people in line, even when doubts creep in. This is how belief systems enforce themselves without leaders. Now consider the role of moral identity. Many people don't just see themselves as informed, they see themselves as ethical. On the right side of history. Standing up for victims. Challenging power. Those are noble impulses. But when a narrative frames belief as moral duty, skepticism becomes immoral. Asking for proof feels like minimizing harm. Questioning claims feels like siding with villains. This moral framing shuts down inquiry. Because no one wants to see themselves as unethical. So belief persists, not because it's solid, but because it feels righteous. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of rumor culture. It hijacks morality. Now let's talk about contradiction, because identity doesn't tolerate it well. When someone encounters evidence that challenges a narrative they identify with, discomfort arises. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. The brain wants to resolve it quickly. There are two options: re-evaluate the belief, or reinterpret the evidence. Re-evaluation threatens identity. Reinterpretation preserves it. So reinterpretation wins. Evidence becomes suspect. Sources become compromised. Motives are questioned. The narrative adapts. This is why these stories are so resilient. They're not rigid. They're flexible. They bend to protect the identity built around them. Now here's something crucial. Once belief becomes identity, escalation feels necessary. Why? Because identity needs reinforcement. Watching the same level of content no longer produces the same emotional payoff. So narratives intensify. Claims get bolder. Language gets harsher. Stakes get higher. This keeps the identity energized, but it also pushes the story further from reality. Now consider how this affects discourse. People on opposite sides of these narratives aren't just disagreeing about facts. They're defending identities. One side sees themselves as awake and aware. The other sees themselves as rational and evidence-based. Each feels threatened by the other. So conversations become combative. Not because people are cruel, but because identity feels under attack. And identity always fights back. This is why moderation fails. This is why fact checks inflame rather than resolve. This is why even calm explanations are dismissed. They don't address the real stake. The real stake is self-concept. Now let's turn the lens inward, because this applies to everyone, including people who pride themselves on skepticism. Identity can form around disbelief too. I'm not like those people. I don't fall for that stuff. I'm smarter than that. That identity can be just as rigid. It can prevent empathy. It can dismiss emotional factors. It can underestimate how persuasion works. So this isn't a story about gullible audiences versus smart critics. It's a story about human psychology, about how easily stories attach themselves to who we think we are. Now here's the pivotal realization. The most effective narratives don't just tell you what to believe. They tell you who you are for believing it. That's the hook beneath the hook. And once you see that, a question emerges. If belief is part of identity, what happens when the belief collapses? The answer is uncomfortable. People don't just lose a story. They lose certainty. They lose belonging. They lose a sense of being right. That loss feels like grief. And grief is something the mind resists fiercely. So instead of letting go, many people double down. They seek reaffirmation. They seek louder voices. They seek more extreme versions. Not because they're irrational, but because they're protecting themselves. Now pause. Think about how many online arguments aren't really about the topic at hand. They're about respect, status, belonging. This is why discussions escalate so quickly. A challenge to the narrative is interpreted as a challenge to the person. Now let's connect this back to the story we've been unpacking. The reason this particular narrative became so entrenched isn't just its content. It's how effectively it offered identity. The aware versus the blind. The brave versus the complicit. The truth seekers versus the deceived. Those roles are seductive, and once adopted, they're hard to surrender. This is why even framing the story as rumor analysis feels threatening to some, because it destabilizes the role. It says, you might not be a detective uncovering truth. You might be part of a system that rewards certainty. That's a hard thing to accept. Now here's the hopeful part, because there is one. Identity is not fixed. People can outgrow narratives, but it requires a different kind of validation. Not you were right, but you're thoughtful. You're reflective. You're willing to sit with uncertainty. Those qualities don't perform well online. They're quiet. They don't outrage. They don't trend, but they're powerful, and they're rare. Now let's step toward the final question. If these narratives persist because of identity, emotion, incentives, and systems, what breaks the cycle? Not censorship, not shaming, not louder counter-narratives. Something else. Awareness. Not awareness of the claims, but awareness of the mechanics. When people see how their emotions are being engaged, their identity flattered, their attention monetized, something shifts. Distance appears. Curiosity returns. And curiosity is the enemy of certainty. In the final section, we're going to tie everything together. We're going to revisit the opening whisper and explain why whispers are more powerful than shouts. We'll look at what it means to stay curious without becoming convinced. And we'll answer the question that's been hovering over this entire series. If so many of these stories are built the same way, what does it mean to truly be informed in an age where information is infinite, but understanding is rare? Because that answer matters far more than any rumor ever could. It always begins quietly. Not with a shout, not with a headline, but with a whisper that feels like insight. A whisper that says, there's more to this. A whisper that flatters curiosity and rewards suspicion. A whisper that doesn't demand belief, only attention. And that's why whispers are more powerful than shouts. Shouts trigger defenses. Whispers invite proximity. You lean in. You listen. You fill in the gaps yourself. Which brings us back to the beginning. This story was never really about a claim. It was about a process. A process that turns curiosity into conviction, emotion into certainty, participation into identity. And once you understand that, the fog starts to lift. Think about how many times you've heard a story described as too big to be fake. That phrase sounds logical. It feels intuitive. But history tells us the opposite. The biggest myths are not built on solid foundations. They're built on repetition, alignment, and emotional payoff. They grow not because they're accurate, but because they're adaptable. They absorb contradictions. They survive debunking. They thrive on uncertainty. And that's not an accident. It's a feature of an ecosystem that rewards attention over understanding. So what does it mean to be informed in that ecosystem? It doesn't mean knowing every rumor. It doesn't mean connecting every